The revolt of 1857 had given a very strong jolt to the British rule in India. The courage, sacrifice, and patriotism that Indians demonstrated in this fight remains unparalleled in the history of our country. For several months, the position of British rule in India had become completely untenable. Although a failure in the immediate sense, nevertheless, revolt of 1857 marks a watershed in the history of British rule in India. These rebels will inspire subsequent generations with a tradition of resistance. Even in their failure, they will pave the way for a more modern response to British colonialism. The British too will be compelled to have a tectonic shift in their approach to the crown jewel India. Consequently, several new types of policies will be ushered in by the Britishers in the wake of this revolt. Hello dear students, and welcome back to our discussion on modern Indian history. In this episode, we will discuss the impact of revolt of 1857, understanding its significance, the debates that surround it, and also the long-term consequences that it led to. So let's dive in and get started with today's discussion. The revolt of 1857 had caused a lot of discomfort in London. Already there were a lot of voices against the East India Company since the end of the 18th century. The Charter Act of 1853 had not even given a specific time period for the EIC's rule in India, unlike earlier Charter Acts. Consequently, it was very well known that the days of EIC were now numbered. Given the kind of jolt that revolt of 1857 gave, the Queen, the crown itself, felt compelled to assuage India and Indian public opinion. It gave out a series of promises to Indians so that the major grudges that they had could at least be mollified. Now, what were the assurances that the Queen gave in 1858 in this proclamation? We will see that one by one. Number one in that is the promise of no territorial extension. The British rule in India had used many different tools such as policy of effective control, subsidiary alliance, and direct annexations. Very often, ideas like doctrine of lapse and the concept of misrule were used for territorially aggrandizing British India. This had made Indian princes very nervous. Despite their best loyalties, the Indian prince could never be sure of the perpetuity of his family's rule. During the revolt of 1857, the British realized the salience of Indian princes being on their side. And consequently, their major concern was hereby addressed. And this promise was upheld. This is the reason why we will see more than 560 odd princely states to be integrated into India at the time of independence. It's on account of this promise, the princely states remained intact till then. Apart from their continuity of their rule, they were also promised that their rights, dignity, and honor will never be compromised. This was to assure the princely states that they will continue to live with the same kind of lifestyle, honor, respect, dignity, etc., which they were enjoying earlier. The treaties and engagements with these princes will be honored was a solemn promise that the British Crown gave. We have seen in the past that East India Company had time and again breached its promises. We saw how the Nizam was promised help against the Marathas, but he was not given the help during Battle of Kharda. The Amirs of Sindh had been promised perpetual friendship, only to be annexed subsequently. Many other such examples can be cited of hypocrisy of the East India Company's rule. But here, they are promised that the treaties and all the commitments will be honored. Clemency was announced for all the offenders who had participated in the revolt of 1857, except those who were direct participants, as in those who were leading the revolts or who had caused murders or shielded the murderers. Apart from these people, clemency was offered to all Indians. Indians, irrespective of race or creed, were to be admitted to office. The start of this ending of racial discrimination was seen in Charter Act of 1833 itself. but the court of directors had prevailed and the discrimination continued. Then in Charter Act of 1853, we saw that system of open competitive examination was to be introduced. And once again, the Crown promised that Indians will not be discriminated on the basis of race or creed while admitting them to office. This promise, although on paper it existed, but in practice, we will see subsequently that there were many hurdles for Indians to actually join service under the government. Nevertheless, a commitment was given. Justice and religious toleration was to be ensured in India. There would not be any injustice meted out to Indian subjects by the state. Their religious practices were not to be interfered with. A big section of the rebels was offended because of the constant reforms that the Britishers were bringing about. They had abolished sati, widow remarriage had been permitted, practices like slavery had been abolished, female infanticide had been stopped. Now, these measures were definitely progressive measures, but back then the society found this to be intrusive. And consequently, the Britishers realized that it is best that they stay away from these internal matters. The Army of East India Company, a huge army that had been built up, was to be incorporated now into the Army of British India. So those troops who had not rebelled, their services were to be continued. Those who had rebelled had already been, shot, punished, and many of them had simply melted away. The regiments had been disbanded. So a very significant document in this manner was issued by the Crown itself to assuage Indian public opinion so that there will be normalcy back again and the Britishers can gather themselves and run the state. This is the Queen's Proclamation, guys. Now let us see, as the dust settles down on revolt of 1857, what are the significant points that we must remember while answering questions in mains. What is the role of revolt of 1857 in the course of our freedom struggle? The revolt of 1857 was an unsuccessful but a heroic effort to bring back the old regime. They had made Bahadur Shah Zafar as their leader. In different storm centers, the rebels were being led by, dispossessed Rajas, Nawabs, and big Zamindars. They all had united together, but for the sake of bringing back the old way of life, the feudal socio-politico-economic system. Nevertheless, it was successful in giving a very strong jolt to a modern power. It could not defeat or end it, but definitely it was strong enough to give it a big shock. It ended the rule of EIC, East India Company, in India. The Crown transferred power from the East India Company directly to the British government. This is a very significant measure. The rule of EIC, which had started in around mid-18th century, now finally a curtain is drawn onto it and a new era of direct British rule will start. Although this was already in the making, we have seen how increasingly the British Parliament was exercising its control on the government here in India. But nevertheless, this final shock ensured that EIC's rule met a quick demise and there was a takeover by the British Crown. The Crown's rule was inaugurated. The shock that the Britishers got in this revolt, the successes, although ephemeral, that the rebels achieved, that helped to break the idea of British invincibility. Britishers had built up a reputation of being invincible. Over the course of last century or more, they had won several battles and wars, and consequently, the Company Bahadur enjoyed a reputation of being invincible. That obviously was rubbed onto the white Anglo-Saxon race, that these people are indefeatable. But during the revolt of 1857, the kind of courage that Indian troops, Indian rebels, they showed, in many places, the Britishers had to retreat. And consequently, this image of invincibility of the Britishers suffered a very big shock. Now that fear of the British army will subside to a very great extent. It created the space for emergence of modern national struggle. The limitations of this type of traditional response traditional response that is based on violence, that lacks understanding of colonialism, that does not have modern political tools. All of that dawned on Indians very clearly. Although they were reverent and respectful towards the rebels, they also distanced themselves slowly from their methods, from their goals. And consequently, we'll see a much more qualitative response evolving in the form of modern national struggle that Indians will wage. We will see that this revolt will establish a tradition of resistance, courage, and sacrifice, which will keep on inspiring Indians over the next few generations to fight against the British rule. So, in this sense, the revolt of 1857 is an extremely crucial one in the history of India. Now, let us see some debates and opinions that historians have over this revolt. One major debate that is there about the revolt of 1857 is its nature. What was the nature of this revolt like? Some historians have the opinion that it was merely a sepoy mutiny. Merely a sepoy mutiny. The term sepoy comes from the Persian term sipahi, soldier, anglicized as a loan word into sepoy. The idea that revolt of 1857 was nothing more than a sepoy mutiny is subscribed to by British historians like Sir John Seeley and Sir John Lawrence. They focus only on the sepoy related aspects of this revolt without taking into consideration the huge significant participation of other civilians, the zamindars, the rajas, the nawabs, the peasantry, the artisans who joined the revolt. This is also concurred with by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who was a judge, a lower judge in the British judicial system, and also Munshi Jeevan Lal. They too concur that this was just a sepoy mutiny. Now, this is basically coherent with British ideology in India. The Britishers wanted to distance the civilian population from the rebelling sepoys. And therefore, we see that they will focus more on this aspect of sepoy mutiny, that this was just limited to sepoys and others hardly at all participated. That was far from the truth. No doubt it was the sepoys who started it, but without a shade of doubt, a huge number of people from all sections participated in this revolt. So in that sense, calling it just a sepoy mutiny is actually a service to basically British vested interest alone. Later historians, when research of history matures and becomes more serious, it is freed from the colonial objectives. Later historians will disregard this opinion and say that no, it wasn't just a sepoy mutiny, it was much more than that, including British historians like Judith Brown, who accept that calling it a sepoy mutiny was basically a bias of early British historians. History evolves, guys. History is studied from the prism of the historian. And historian develops a perspective of looking at something. That perspective in those times was not necessarily objective. It was colored with the vested interest of the British colonial rule. Consequently, we see this sort of opinion that it was just a sepoy mutiny. On the other hand, there is a polar opposite sort of an opinion which calls it a national revolt, a complete national revolt as such. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar, the famous revolutionary from Maharashtra, he had written a book, The Indian War of Independence. This book was written in his early years as a revolutionary, and in this book, he has opined that this was a national revolt. This should be also seen in its specific context. Just as the British opinions have to be seen in their context of colonial rule, this also must be seen in the context of the rising nationalist movement in India. Towards the close of 19th century, early 20th century, Indians will start to gather themselves, start to develop modern political tools and agitate against the Britishers. At that point, naturally, they will look for some inspiration, and that inspiration was this relatively recent episode of revolt of 1857. So the changed circumstances lead to a changed perspective also of looking at this issue. S.B. Chaudhary is another scholar who concurred with this view. The criticism that is levied on this view, we saw the criticism of the earlier view also, and this view that it was a national revolt, we can say that modern nationalism as such was not visible in the sepoys. These sepoys before the revolt were serving East India Company. These sepoys were helping the East India Company to suppress many regional powers. So one revolt and everything changes, that is also historically difficult to accept. No common vision amongst the rebels is also clear. Unlike the later day freedom struggle, where there will be a large consensus at least on what we should do on exit of Britishers, what sort of a country state we want to establish, that will not be visible during the revolt of 1857. Each one was fighting his own battle or war. So in that sense, calling it a national revolt is also criticized by some historians. Apart from this, we also come across opinions of some other scholars that we must know. T.R. Holmes, for example, calls it a conflict between civilization and barbarianism. Civilization and barbarianism. Civilization, of course, represents the white civilization, the British, and barbarianism is actually hinting towards Indians. The kind of, barbarity that Britishers have committed during the course of expansion of their rule is conveniently overlooked. Yes, the revolt was violent, but then the context of it was the brutal rise of British power. Nevertheless, a British historian looks at it from this perspective. James Outram calls it a Mohammedan, or that is Muslim, conspiracy against capital of Hindu grievances. Mohammedan conspiracy making capital of Hindu grievances. This is in tune with the divide and rule policy which will be very sharply implemented after revolt of 1857. The Britishers realized the importance of Hindu-Muslim unity. They knew that this unity will make modern Indian nationalism stronger. They would rather prefer to have as many fissures in the society as possible, and the chief amongst them was based on religion. And consequently, this sort of opinion is natural in that context. R.C. Muzumdar and S.N. Sen, they differ with the view that it was a national revolt, and they say it was not an organized national revolt. Muzumdar, historian during those British times itself, neither first nor national war of independence. On serious academic research, he comes to the opinion that neither is this first, because there were other earlier revolts also, and then he differs with calling it as national war of independence. Okay, so these are the major opinions that we must know. And lastly comes that of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, ever the modern thinker, a person who was fascinated by history. He has written World History while being imprisoned, a book on world history while being imprisoned. He says essentially this revolt was a feudal outburst, because see the kind of leaders that were there in the revolt, the Rajas, Nawabs, Zamindars, Talukdars. So he's saying that it was a feudal outburst headed by feudal chiefs and their followers. So he opines that the nature of revolt of 1857 must be seen in terms of these feudal elements and characteristics. Aided by widespread anti-foreign sentiment. Yes, this was there. Anti-foreign sentiment was there, but essentially it was a feudal outburst led by feudal chiefs and their followers. So these are opinions of British and Indian people on revolt of 1857. All right. Let's go ahead, and before we discuss further the revolt of 1857, a very important announcement is coming your way, guys. We are now starting from the 10th of October, our new evening batch, Prelims to Interview batch. The speciality of this batch is that this batch can be availed with different validities. Silver validity being for 1 year, gold for a couple of years, and platinum for 3 years. So now, depending on what your plan for civil services examination is, if it's 2024, 2025 or 2026, Accordingly, you can purchase this batch with the appropriate validity, 1, 2, or 3 years. This will help you to pace your preparation accordingly. What very often happens is those students who are planning for say 2025 or 2026, they feel that they will start preparing the next year. But then preparing it in 1 year itself, has its own set of challenges. If you start serious preparation right away, then you will be able to optimize the next 1 year before you. And for some reason, because of college or your work, anything, if you miss out on something during that course, you will have the validity to view the lectures once again so that your preparation does not get hampered. So this is a unique kind of a model that StudyIQ IAS has brought, and the lectures, the batch is going to start from 10th of October, 6 p.m. in the evening. This batch is a regular P2I content batch. So it has all the features that you all know very well and love it. We have got exceptionally great feedback from the students who are undergoing this course right now, and hence this new offering in the month of October. This batch will give you not only live classroom teaching, but also exceptionally good quality study material. The textbook on which this series is based, Modern Indian History, that and several other very good quality textbooks, study material, notes will be delivered at your doorstep. You'll get daily mains answer writing practice. Daily you'll be writing questions on a daily basis. Then every day you'll also have sessions for current affairs, dedicated for current affairs. You'll get PDFs of daily current affairs also. Apart from this, you'll also have Sunday tests on MCQs. 50 questions based MCQ test on every single Sunday will be held, which will include current affairs questions also. This and loads of other benefits are there in the Prelims to Interview or P2I batch. Don't hesitate anymore. Jump in right away. Use my code JD Live to get a handsome discount on the fees of this batch and enroll for it before time runs out. Successful people are those who take decisions at the right moment. Don't delay your decision any further. Whether you're preparing for 2024, 25 or 26, there is now no excuse for you from enrolling in this particular batch. All right. If you enroll, then myself and other faculties whom you see on the StudyIQ IAS channel, all of them will be interacting with you with their respective subjects. So enroll for it quickly. I'll see you in the class. This, by the way, is the QR code which you can use to reach my channel, Jawwad Kazi UPSC Preparation. There you will get my notes, including of this lecture today, as well as previous ones. You'll also get a lot of updates about my videos and other things that I keep on sharing. All right. Now, after the revolt of 1857, we are going to see a very different type of British rule in India. The attitude or approach that Britishers had towards Indians is going to undergo a sea change because of this revolt. What will now change in their attitude? Let us try to understand that quickly. Number one, divide and rule policy. Divide and rule policy. Now, this policy or stratagem is as old as the Roman times, right? But then Britishers, although they had used it, in the politics of Indian princes, now divide and rule policy will be used at a social level. Every single fissure that exists within the Indian society will be exploited by the Britishers to divide and rule. They will constantly like to portray that, see, you Indians are so divided that we cannot even try to give you independence, because whom should we hand over the independent India to? You are all not on one same page on any single issue. That will be their stratagem. Divide and rule. Keep Hindus fighting against Muslims. Savarnas or upper caste, so-called, fighting with the lower caste. Regions fighting against one another. Linguistic differences will be exploited. In this manner, they will constantly try to use the policy of divide and rule. They will use native rulers and zamindars now as, breakwaters against popular revolts. Revolt of 1857 had made them understand the value of native princes and big elites like zamindars and talukdars. It was the zamidars and talukdars of Awadh who had really, made things difficult and challenging for them in that area. They realized that without co-opting these elites into the colonial state, it would not be possible for them to perpetuate their rule. So the approach of Britishers now towards these elements is going to change. They will try to have these elements on their side. Policy of annexations as declared by the Queen was now given up. No more territories will be taken over. Britain to be made paramount power. Until this point, there were subsidiary allies who, at least in terms of theory, had sovereignty. But after revolt of 1857, although the princely states will be allowed to rule and govern, it will be made very clear that the paramount power is the British Crown. And all of these only exist as agents of the British state. And this was emphasized in the Grand Darbar that was held in 1877, where the Queen of England was given the title of Empress of India or Kaisar-e-Hind. Kaisar-e-Hind. Okay, Kaisar-e-Hind basically means Empress of India. So this was done to emphasize on the paramountcy of British power. Socio-religious initiatives which the Britishers had earlier dabbled into will now be stopped. The Britishers had taken several measures. We know about sati abolition, allowing of widow remarriage, allowing inheritance in terms of people who have converted to other religion, stopping of slavery. Many such initiatives were taken by Britishers. Although back then also they were very circumspect while doing these things. But after revolt of 1857, they are going to be twice as much circumstance, if not more, while taking any such initiative. Barring age of consent and some other measures, we don't see any radical reform being brought about by the Britishers. Racial discrimination will now become more pronounced. Yes, they were always racist. Lord Cornwallis is known to have had a very poor opinion about India and Indians. Most of these governor generals, viceroys, and British officials were racist. Yes, exceptions will be there, but exceptions prove the norm, as they say. This racism will become even more sharper after revolt of 1857. Britishers will constantly want to have a hegemony over Indian minds. To have that sense of superiority, they will completely dissociate with the Indians and try to make them feel inferior, whenever an opportunity presented itself. So there will be separate clubs for the Britishers, areas will be reserved, coaches in trains, benches in parks. Many such things will be done to basically segregate and show Indians down. This will be the changed attitude of Britishers after revolt of 1857. Now, apart from this, there will be a very significant difference that will be brought about in the matters of British Army. The Sepoy Mutiny of Meerut. In our last class, we have discussed previous mutinies and we understood how during the course of revolt of 1857, it was Meerut, earlier Barakpur, and then Meerut, which actually ignited this mutiny of troops of EIC. In context of that mutiny, the Britishers will do a lot of introspection regarding the army. Ultimately, it was the army that was their tool, most important tool to perpetuate its rule over India. If this most important tool starts to malfunction, then the British state would collapse in no time. This they understood very well during revolt of 1857. And hence, in this context, they will reform the army, to a very great extent so that this does not recur later. The brotherhood and homogeneity that the Bengal army possessed will be seen as a problematic factor. The Bengal army being recruited from, a similar catchment area, Eastern Uttar Pradesh, Awadh, Bihar, that area, having similar type of composition had led to brotherhood and homogeneity amongst the troops. And this had made them have a feeling of fraternity, leading to revolts in different parts simultaneously. So Britishers will act upon this brotherhood and homogeneity so that troops will not have that feeling of fraternity amongst themselves. How will they do that? We'll see that shortly. Second aspect will be changing the counterpoise of Europeans and native races. Lord Dalhousie had himself understood the importance of having a favorable balance between European and Indian troops. He had already started the steps and measures for that, but it could not be done in time. After revolt of 1857, we will see that this will be taken up with great earnestness. By the time we are into second half of 19th century, the British are the biggest imperial power in the world. And to maintain that status of the greatest imperial power, they required a very strong army. The British Indian Army in that context was very important. British Indian Army will not only serve as defense of India, but it will also be used in other battlefronts in distant areas, other continents also. So all of this made army reforms after revolt of 1857 very crucial. Let us now see how the reorganization of the army will take place. After the revolt, the forces of the company were now merged with that of the crown. British Indian Army will take over the soldiers of East India Company. The EIC before revolt of 1857 had 230,000 plus soldiers. Out of that, about 45 to 50,000 were Europeans, rest were Indians. Now, from amongst the Indians, almost half of them had rebelled. So there's no question of those half. The remaining troops, they had been, inducted into the British Indian Army. The strength of European troops was increased so that there is a equipoise, as we discussed earlier. Number of Indian troops was reduced and British troops was increased. The proportion of troops in the army was made 1:2 for Bengal. 1:2 for Bengal. Earlier it was 1:6. Now, according to some sources, it is 1:5, but largely you can remember 1:6 was the ratio of European to Indian troops. In Bengal, this was changed to 1:2. Whereas in case of Bombay and Madras, it was 1:3. Now, why this special treatment for Bengal? The reason is the history. The revolt of 1857 made it necessary that Bengal had a stronger presence of European troops. Distinction was made between martial and non-martial races. Those races or communities which had remained loyal to the Britishers during the revolt of 1857 were declared as martial, and those that had rebelled were declared as non-martial. So troops from Punjab, Nepal, North and Northwest, right? So Punjabis, Sikhs, Pathans, Gorkhas, all of these people, Baloch also, they were considered as martial races, whereas troops from Awadh, Bihar, Central India, they were declared as non-martial. Okay, so this was an arbitrary distinction. They wanted troops who will remain loyal to them. The test was revolt of 1857. Those who remained loyal, they were rewarded in this manner. Okay. We'll see that a substantial proportion or a bulk rather of Indian Army will come from Punjab and those adjoining areas. Steps were taken to encourage regional loyalties among soldiers. Soldiers should not have a pan-India kind of a feeling. Instead, they must be connected to some regional sort of an identity. And this is how regiments will be structured. Sir Charles Wood, famous for the Wood's Dispatch earlier, 1854, later will become the second Secretary of State. After revolt of 1857, the position of Secretary of State will be created. The first will be Lord Stanley, followed by Sir Charles Wood. He, encapsulates this feeling very well. If one regiment mutinies, I should like to have the next regiment so alien that it would be ready to fire into it. That is the kind of regimentation they want to create in the Indian Army. So you will have regiments that are based on regional identities or on ethnic religious identities. And they are then segregated. Those troops are kept together, commanded by officers trained by the British. This was the type of structure that the British had created. Fine. So we have understood the change of attitude. We have seen the reforms in the army. Now let us see the act that was passed at the end of revolt of 1857. the Government of India Act of 1858. Let us see what will be the measures brought in this act. This is going to be a significant act, guys. UPSC has asked questions on this earlier, so we need to remember the points. Crown takes over formally now. The rule of East India Company is brought to an end, and with this, the British Crown formally takes over rule in India. All the government, territories, revenue, whatever the company had in the past will now be held by the British Crown. The structure that was created by Pitt's India Act, dual control structure, board of control with its 6 commissioners, and court of directors representing the company shareholders. This type of structure was not required anymore because company is not there, and then already British government has taken over, so board of control was not required. So all of this is now abolished. Indians were to get opportunity to serve under the British, but as we saw earlier, this was more a lip service. In practice, there were many limitations or hurdles that Indians had to surmount to actually even get close to this service. A new office was created of Secretary of State. This office will be in London. Secretary of State would be a cabinet rank officer, and he will be ultimate in charge of Indian administration and will be responsible to the British Parliament. He will be answerable to the British Parliament directly. So he is a British Minister for Indian Affairs, will work as constitutional advisor for the Crown in all matters related to British India. Lord Stanley, remember the name for prelims, became the first Secretary of State. Second one was Charles Wood. To support or aid this office of Secretary of State, there would be a Council of India to help him out. This council will have 15 members. 15 members to help out the Secretary of State with issues of India. This will be done through an office which is called as India Office. So Secretary of State is heading this establishment called as India Office, and together they are called as State in Council, Secretary of State and his 15-member council, also called as the India Office in London. All the expenses of this office were paid out of Indian revenue. All the expenses. Why? Because he is discharging the role of having an oversight over the British government over here, and hence his expenses have to be borne by Indian revenue. Indians will raise this issue, protest that this expense has to be borne by the British government. They want to have an oversight over here, right? So why should Indians bear the cost of their oversight? The British government should bear that cost. This will be an issue that Indians will raise and ultimately get that resolved also. Apart from this, a new office of Viceroy is created. Vice, as we have the terms like Vice Captain. So similarly, Viceroy means deputy of the royals. Deputy next to the royal, right? So like Vice Captain, we have Viceroy. This office is created so that the relationship between the British Crown and the princely state would have a representative here in India in the form of Viceroy. The title of Governor General is now replaced by Viceroy, but this person is going to perform both the responsibilities. As Viceroy, he is the connect with the princely state, and also he carries forward the responsibility of Governor General as the main administrator of British India. That's why you will see that after independence, Lord Mountbatten will be referred to as Governor General, okay, not as Viceroy, because the relationship with the princely states comes to an end with the Independence of India Act, and consequently there is no need for this title after independence, but then he still continues as Governor General for some time. No major changes in administrative setup in India. Whatever is happening in Government of India Act, it is largely taking place where? It is taking place in London. So Secretary of State is created there, Viceroy, the title is given, and some other measures are made. Governor General of India will now be referred to as Viceroy, and Lord Canning, who was already in the office as Governor General, he became the first Viceroy of India. Earlier Executive Council of Governor General, which consisted of 4 members, now After a few years, a fifth member will be added in 1861. Whenever we say 4 members and then 5 members, we have to remember that this does not include Governor General and the Commander of the Army. These two positions are ex officio positions. So this fourth and fifth member are in addition. Please remember that. We don't count Governor General in it. 1874, sixth member will get added. So this is how the Council of Governor General will keep on expanding. These were the measures of Government of India Act of 1858. Now, after these measures, within a few years' time, a new act will be passed for changing some structures here in India, and that will be called as Indian Council Act of 1861. Indian Council Act of 1861. What is the context of this act? Revolt of 1857 and the shock that it created necessitated some changes being made here in India also. And therefore we see that Council Act of India's focus will be to make changes here in India. Bombay and Madras, which earlier had been deprived of their legislative powers, will demand for restoration of these powers. Since 1833, they have resented this loss and they are demanding for restoration. Central legislature that was created earlier was not able to satisfy the needs of the provinces. Now, back then, systems of communication were not as good as we have in our times. Consequently, the local demands, local needs were not appreciated by the central legislature. And therefore, the laws that were required in provinces were not being passed. And therefore, there will be demand for more and more legislative devolution towards the provinces. Government of India Act 1858, which we just saw, was focused on changes in London and not on changes in India. Some changes were required in Indian context also that the earlier act had not done. Apart from this, exclusion of Indians from legislative process. Indians had not been given any say or opportunity in law making for their own country. The Britishers realized that this leads to grievances. Indian opinion must be heard even if it is not given any significant power. So Indians had to be involved in the process of law making. Lastly, Indian opinion for reforms. The intellectual Indians had been demanding reforms for quite some time. This intellectual Indian opinion also had to be satisfied. In the context of all of these developments, we will see the Council Act of 1861 will be brought about. The Indian Council Act of 1861. Now let us see how the Indian Council Act of 1861 will change things. A fifth member was now added to the Governor General's Council. You remember it starts first with Regulating Act. 4 members were there as per Regulating Act, right? Then in the next act, Pitt's India Act, it was reduced to 3. Then Charter Act again increased it to 4 in 1833. Now a fifth member was added by the Council Act of 1861. Additional 6 to 12 members will be there in the legislative, in the council for legislative purpose. Their role, minimum 6, maximum 12 members, their role will be only for law making purpose. They are not there for executive role. Executive role is Governor General plus these 5 members and the Commander-in-Chief. They are in the executive. Rest all are part of legislature. Half of non-officials to be nominated by Viceroy. Half out of these. So if 6 are appointed, then 3 have to be non-officials. If 12 are appointed, then 6 have to be non-officials. What do we mean by non-officials then? Non-officials means those people who are not in the service of the British government. Such people are termed as non-officials. Usually, it was a practice to appoint 3 Indians over here in this. This was not mandated by the law as such, but the general practice was that 3 Indians will be there in these non-official members. Additional powers were given to Viceroy so that he could have control over this legislative council. The executive has to be dominant. It's a colonial state ultimately. So the viceroy had special powers. Bombay and Madras were now given back their powers, taken away in Charter Act of 1833. Now they are given back their powers. They were required to take prior permission of Governor General on sensitive issues. When it came to defense, communication, such kind of issues, they had to take permission. This was done to ensure that these councils should not pass laws that are at cross purpose with the British rule in India. Then legislative councils for several provinces were now created. Bengal, NWP, Northwest Province, Burma and Punjab. These will get their councils in 1862, 1886 and 1897 respectively. The provision was in the Council Act of 1861 that legislative councils could be created for these provinces. Governor General could now create a new province for legislative purpose and also appoint lieutenant governors over there as required. Since many of the provinces were large and unwieldy for administrative purposes, it was sometimes imperative to actually restructure them. Governor General has the power and he can also appoint lieutenant governors over there, create provinces for legislative purposes. This is Indian Council Act, guys. Now let us see briefly the significance of Indian Council Act. In my last lecture on constitutional development in British rule, I had told you that from the inception of Regulating Act till revolt of 1857, the trend of British laws was towards centralization of power. But after revolt of 1857, this trend will become exactly opposite, reverse of it. Instead of centralization, we will see more of devolution of powers. Back then, British government wanted to have a control on EIC's rule here, and hence centralization in Calcutta made it easier for them to control East India Company's rule. But now, since after revolt of 1857, it is directly British rule, that centralization was not required, not necessary. And hence we see the trend of devolution of powers, especially legislative powers. All of this will continue and culminate with Government of India Act of 1935, where there will be a All India Federation planned between British India and princely states, an All India Federation. Substantial powers will be given to the provinces. Britishers wanted to make provinces strong so that they will have centrifugal tendencies from the freedom struggle. And hence, this idea was floated in Government of India Act of 1935. Association of Indians now began in earnestness for the first time. Indians now will be nominated as non-officials in the Legislative Council. But here it wasn't as if, reform-minded, modern Indian liberal thinkers were appointed. Their selection was always based on loyalty to the Britishers. Those princes who had remained loyal to the Britishers or those intellectuals who were pro-British, only such people were appointed as members of the council, Indian members of the council. The council also had very limited powers. They could not, talk about budget. There were many limitations. They could not ask the executive questions. It was just more like an advisory body. So although it's a step in evolution, but if we look at it standalone, that it does not have sufficient powers to discharge its responsibility. Often favorites of the Britishers were appointed over here and not nationalists. The Governor General continued to have ordinance making powers, continued to have those powers. So he did not require the council's approval as such. He could, right away make ordinances wherever he felt necessary for British rule. The Governor General could also legislate for the whole of India. It wasn't as if when provinces were given powers, there was a separation of subjects. No, that has not happened. Governor General is almighty, all powerful, and his council can create law for any subject for any part of the country. We haven't yet reached the stage where there will be segregation of subjects on which center can make laws and provinces can make laws. That is still some distant away. At this stage, the provinces have been given very limited powers for lawmaking. Largely, the power is concentrated with the Governor General and his council. But please remember, this is an evolution. Okay, we have just started to devolve power down to provinces. So we have to take, incremental steps. It failed to satisfy opinion of the Indians. This will be a common point whenever we discuss any constitutional reform that the Britishers will bring in. Whether it is Council Act of 1861, 1892, Parliamentary reforms of 1909, Montfort reforms of 1919, or Government of India Act of 1935. We will always conclude with this point that it failed to satisfy Indian opinion. Indians were expecting much more reforms, a lot more association of Indians and powers in the council, but that did not happen. This, dear students, is the Council Act of 1861, passed in the aftermath of revolt of 1857. This concludes our discussion for today. In our next class, we are going to see significant trends in modern response that Indians will give. We will be discussing socio-religious reform movements and creation of modern political organizations leading to formation of Indian National Congress. So we have now, sort of crossed that threshold of our modern Indian history, where we are entering a very exciting phase where there will be a lot of action by Indians against the British rule in a modern form. I'll see you in my next class, guys. If you've loved this lecture, then do smash that like button, leave some love in the comment box, and share this video with your friends. Thank you all. I'll see you in the next class. Thank you.